WNYC Studios is supported by Wise. Wise, the smart way to manage the currencies you need around the world. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies with only a few simple taps. Be smart. Get Wise. Download the Wise app today. Terms and conditions apply.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. Here's a reality with the Supreme Court canceling much of the Voting Rights Act. The court locked the federal government out of the redistricting debate to a large degree and gave it almost entirely to the states. You probably know that. And it's just the latest example of how much political change in whatever direction now runs through state capitals. Texas and California and others have now changed their congressional districts. Just this week, South Carolina surprised some people by deciding not to lock out their only black member of Congress, Jim Clyburn. The New York state budget finally got approved last night with many policy changes that respond to the court and to the Trump administration. We'll look at some of those specifics in our next segment. So political change in whatever direction runs so much through the state capitals now. It runs through Trenton and Albany and Sacramento, yes, through Austin and Baton Rouge, through Columbus and Columbia, through Madison and Tallahassee, less through Washington and more through Lincoln. That's the capital of Nebraska. You didn't know that, did you? Well, one former New York state lawmaker is now the co-founder of a movement called the States Project and author of a new book called The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union. Daniel Squadron argues that not just during the Trump years, but over the last 15 to 20 years, states have done more harm or good than Congress on almost every issue. Let's talk. Daniel Squadron used to represent much of Western Brooklyn in the New York State Senate as a Democrat. He's also been an aide to Senator Chuck Schumer, among other things. Again, his book is called The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union. Daniel, thanks for coming on. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
I'm going to dive right in on one example from your book, then we'll pull back for a larger context. You write that despite President Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, 75% of the goals in the agreement could be accomplished by the states. How'd you come up with that number?
Well, actually, at the States Project, we have a research team that has been looking at this, works with outside advocacy groups and academics and experts. And one way is you actually look at the legislative record and debates in the states that have committed to goals more aggressive than Paris since the first time Trump pulled out of it. And remember, this is a thing Obama entered, Trump exited, Biden entered, Trump exited again. In that period of time, California, New York, Washington, Illinois, a number of others have committed to more aggressive climate goals. And in each case, the legislative record and the background shows what the impact would be. And you can compare that, you can sum that up and compare that to what the federal government committed to.
We just saw that in action in the New York State budget for this fiscal year that got passed last night. It delays implementation of the state's carbon reduction goals in the name of shorter-term affordability, but it represents how much power states have over the issue, right?
Right. The headline there is a huge part of people's household budget is their energy costs. They've gone way up since COVID inflation got started. And it's up to the state to balance these really important competing priorities. You need to be saving people on their bills, making it easy to make ends meet, and you need to be innovating and creating an energy system of the future. It's the biggest surprise of all that isn't that those are complicated, difficult issues that have a huge impact on people's lives. What's surprising is that conversation in Washington is much more irrelevant than in the 50 state capitals.
So give us the bigger picture. Despite the intense pace of change under Trump, why do you say over the last 15 plus years, that time frame, states have done more harm or good than Congress has on almost every issue?
Well, what I like to do is at the States Project, we're largely powered by giving circles, groups of people who come together and create their own identity and choose a state they want to help impact. And so when we get groups of giving circles in a room, I say, what's a domestic policy issue you care about? Open the floor. And on every one, and I've been doing this now 5-6 years, I have never once had a question where in that 15-year period, the federal government, or certainly Congress, has done more than state legislatures have. The challenging one sometimes can be Obamacare. Of course, now that's more than 15 years ago. But the reason it's actually an aha moment for folks is its biggest provision, perhaps, certainly one of the couple most important, was the expansion of Medicaid. That wasn't a thing the federal government did. The federal government made money available to states. Today, 17 years after it was passed, there are nearly 100 million Americans who are not benefiting from the expansion of Medicaid from Obamacare because their state legislatures have refused. But, what are the topics you hear about most from your callers and listeners? And I'll give you the specific example.
So, listeners, we can take them up on that. A few phone calls and texts for Daniel Squadron here. Before we get into the specifics, and there are so many, from the New York State budget, which finally passed last night with our Albany reporter, John Campbell. I don't know how much sleep he's gotten.
I remember those days.
Yeah, right, when you were a legislature. But listeners, 212-433-WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692. You know, one way to put some human meat on the bones of the words in this book, anyone listening who has been an activist on any issue at the state level in New York or New Jersey or Connecticut or any other state, why did you focus there rather than the federal government? Or other current and former state government officials in any state or anyone else, tell us a story or ask a question of Daniel Squadron, former New York State Senator from Brooklyn, founder of the States Project, and author now of The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. We'll get to why your book title, sounds so optimistic considering everything that's going on. But tell us one personal story from your time in the New York State Legislature. Was there like an aha moment where, even though you ran for that office, you obviously wanted that job, you knew you were going into state government, where you realized, wow, this is so much more impactful compared to Washington than I even realized?
It's a funny thing, and I go through this journey in the book, both my own and then other state lawmakers around the country. I ran because I really thought it was the worst place in politics. That was almost the title of the book. And I thought, that's got to be the place you can have the biggest impact if you're trying to just improve things. Start the place that's worst off. What surprised me, my first 2 years in office, I was in the first Democratic trifecta, both chambers of the legislature and the governor, since really the Great Depression, effectively. And I could not believe how much I was able to get done, whether it was permanent funding for public housing or directing nearly $1 billion in new social services money to keep people housed and fed and have more opportunity for jobs and employment. And here's the thing. That 2-year period, for those of your listeners who remember, was maybe the most dysfunctional in the last 5-7 decades of the state. There was a bare majority for Democrats. As I talk about in the book, I think more than a half dozen of my Democratic colleagues, before we even talk about the Republican side, ended up subsequently living in federal penitentiaries for a period. There were no votes to give. There was a coup that shut down the state government for a full month. On every issue, the worst person was the decider, and there was still a huge impact. So that was an enormous lesson for me. The second was after a Florida teen named Trayvon Martin was murdered in Florida, and the person who killed him was not prosecuted because of something called the Stand Your Ground law. I started to learn about something called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the most important organization in American civic life most people have never heard of. And I started to see that ALEC was generating ideas with messaging and policies, including in my own state of New York. In fact, my Republican colleagues were introducing bills and debating them that still had an ALEC watermark on it. And there was no equivalent for people who shared my view and sort of what it means to be to believe in the American values and the American promise.
And so if ALEC was one particular conservative interest group focused on state policies with respect to gun laws, as you mentioned, and other things, you note in the book that Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's big policy blueprint for Trump, was an example of a relentless focus by Heritage on the states. So take us to that level. Relentless focus by Heritage, Project 2025. How, for example?
Well, the same guy who founded ALEC in the early 1970s founded Heritage.
Who's that?
Same year, Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich, who also founded the Moral Majority, which created the coalition between a small group of elite conservative Catholics and the evangelical movement. Actually also founded the first conservative television network with Roger Ailes in the 1970s, the one that didn't go as well as Fox News did 20 years later. And from the beginning, he and some other folks knew that if you were going to try to change the ideological center, if you were going to try to change the issues that the Republican Party focused on, Washington, D.C. was the hardest place to do it. It is it is where the largest donors, elected officials, lobbyists, advocates are, but it's not a place that changes. And so they knew they had to go to the states to try to change the country. And so if you actually look at Trumpism, and if you look at these ideas of, whether the ideological ones of blood and soil that J.D. Vance now talks about, or specific ones like you can never raise taxes for any purpose, these all were pushed in the states because the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s didn't want to do it. And so Weyrich and the Kochs and folks who read the Lewis Powell's famous memo, they did that in the states. Meanwhile, left of center, the Democratic side, there was no equivalent. It just continued to operate like a political party.
So that's what you're trying to do with the States Project. Lewis Powell, the Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, what's that memo?
Prior to becoming a Supreme Court Justice, his next-door neighbor was head of advocacy for the United States Chamber of Commerce and a former state lawmaker, unsurprisingly, asked him to write a memo on how business could reassert itself in its proper place at the center of the public square. And, of course, Lewis Powell talked about the federal government and media, but also said you've got to do state and local. That's where you actually build power.
Before we get to Trumpism and what's going on right now and how it relates to your book and your activist group, another point of history. There was a big wave during the Obama years of Republicans in the Tea Party movement and elsewhere putting a lot of focus on state legislature and governor races. I think you have stats on that, on how many states Republicans came to control, even when the Democrats, Obama and Biden, were president, and how that may be heading somewhat back the other way now. Do you have off the top of your head any of those numbers?
Well, more than 1,000 seats, I think it's more like 1,400 seats, flipped from Republican to Democrat during the period of Obama's presidency. In 2010, the famous Tea Party takeover of Congress flipped more legislative chambers than had ever flipped on a single day. The specific number is eluding me now, but it was in the double digits of legislative chambers that flipped power on Election Day in 2010, as I recall. And we're still living with the consequences of it because state legislatures, as you opened with, draw congressional maps and state legislative maps. And they do it normally after the census that happens every 10 years. They're required to. And so between 2010 and 2012, they redrew the map of the country to make it much harder to have competitive elections to win majorities. And that lasted through the first Trump years. And those maps were what people ran on in 2020 to then draw the maps for this decade, even before Trump's mid-decade redistricting arms race was set off because he personally called state lawmakers in Texas last summer.
And one of the things that I think makes Democrats, and you could say on some level just advocates of democracy, the most nervous is the fact that where did the Trump campaign try to flip the results of the 2020 election? Through state legislatures and state courts, but largely through state legislatures that they hoped would overturn the results as they were counted. And, of course, it didn't happen. It didn't happen maybe in any state, certainly not to the extent that would have changed the outcome of the election. But Republicans have been running for that kind of power in state legislature since. So this is a scary prospect for a lot of people for 2028, maybe even for 2026 this year in congressional elections after they happen, right?
Absolutely. This is a chilling story in the book. Everyone knows the story of January 6th at this point. But I actually think the most dangerous day for the legitimate outcome of the 2020 election was the day before Thanksgiving. People don't know this story, but Trump invited the leaders, Republican leaders of both chambers of the Michigan legislature to the Oval Office personally. He hosted them, and he asked them to have their appointees on the Michigan Board of Canvassers refuse to certify Michigan's election. That night, they were photographed having drinks at the Trump International Hotel, enjoying their little junket to D.C. The next week, one of them agreed and had his appointee vote to prevent the certification of the election. If the other one had agreed as well, Michigan's election would have gone into chaos. That would have started dominoes on other states scrambling to do Trump's bidding and undermine the legitimate election. Things like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia or January 6th never would have occurred because the dominoes would have been falling. He knew, Donald Trump, that the way to undermine the result of the election was through state lawmakers. And thank goodness one Republican in Michigan did the right thing to prevent that.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Daniel Squadron, former New York State Senator from Brooklyn, co-founder of the group, the States Project, and now author of The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union. I invited listeners to give some examples of how they've tried to bring change, positive according to them, on any kind of issue through state government. Then, as I said, we're going to get more into current Trump policy, the Supreme Court. There's a major double standard here that we'll call out or that I'll ask you about. But a couple of stories first. Jane in Port Washington, you're on WNYC. Hi, Jane.
Positive according to them.
Jane, turn your radio off. You're hearing us on delay. Just listen to your phone. Hello. All right, we're going to come back to Jane. Let's try Farhana in Queens. Farhana, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, good morning, Brian, a longtime listener. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm a local activist. I've been born and raised in Queens, but we moved to Long Island, and I'm a Muslim American, and we've been working towards getting Eid holidays passed. Yesterday, we just celebrated Eid al-Adha, and on Long Island, it's a very granular process. And for the last 4 years, we've been going to Albany to advocate for a statewide Eid holiday for school closures so that everyone can celebrate with their families. And, it's a long process, but since we've seen some success on Long Island district by district, it's a very granular process. But having passed a few of the schools, we saw that it is possible. So we've been trying to advocate for it at the state level. And it's been 4 years, and we're still trying to get it passed. New York City has Eid holidays passed, but we're still trying to see if Kathy can get us across the finish. We've worked with all these senators and assemblymen. A few years ago, we were mentored by Zohran Mamdani himself, who really helped us, mentored us and guided us how to advocate for legislation at the state level. And we're hoping to get it passed eventually through the state so that everyone in New York State can celebrate.
Yeah, and it's a good example because you're never going to get a national holiday declared out of, any of the Eids, right? But maybe you can do so at the state level like you did at the local level in New York City.
I love this story only because when I was in office, I represented in the District of Brooklyn, Lower Manhattan, including Manhattan's historic Chinatown. And I led the fight.
And forgive me, I said Brooklyn before, but it also included Lower Manhattan, your old district. Sorry.
I was going to get it in one way or the other on behalf of my constituents, Brian. But I advocated for Lunar New Year to be a school holiday. At some schools in my district, you had 80%
Chinese
rates,
or East Asian
absentee rates during Lunar New Year. And working with Ron Kim and some others, we actually held up the state budget to get it done. That was a decision made by the city, but because of state advocacy, and then Eid and Diwali, I believe, are now holidays because it followed that. Now, I've become a little I wonder a little bit more about whether we could kind of give everyone a couple of days pass so that we have more open days of school, and there's a broader policy question. But the point for this conversation and for your advocacy, which really will succeed if you continue doing it at the state level, is this is a state decision. People look at their local school district, the number of days their kids are in school, when the school day starts and ends. They think that's a local decision. It's heavily controlled by the state.
Now we have Jane in Port Washington with her example, I think. Hi, Jane. You're on WNYC. Take two.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. I was a member of the League of Women Voters, and I was their natural resources person in the 90s. So that shows how old I am. But nevertheless, we worked, my team worked on the bottle bill in New York State. For New York State, I should say. And we did it for 3 years, going to Albany, going out to Long Island, further out in Suffolk County, et cetera. We tried very, very hard. Finally got it passed. Not many states passed it, but I think it made the way easier for more recycling in our state and throughout the country. So I'm very proud of those 3 years. So
the bottle bill is what gave us the 5% deposit so that cans and bottles get recycled because people will bring them back. Are you aware, Jane, that there's a current push in Albany? I'll ask John Campbell in our next segment, our Albany reporter, if this got through. But there's been a push in Albany to increase that to 10 cents so that the people who actually, pay their bills by collecting bottles on the street and then redeeming them, we've all seen those people if we are not one of them, and because the bottle bill was passed that long ago at 5 cents, now they say, hey, with inflation, it should be 10 cents. So is this something you're aware of?
I'm aware of it. It's been talked about even back in the day, making it higher and water bottles being included and all kinds of things that are good innovations, I think. But, in the current political scheme of things, I'm not so sure it's going to happen, but we'll see.
Jane, thank you very much. Yeah, we'll ask John Campbell about that when he comes on in a few minutes. The argument is, hey, if people are so desperate that they're making their living or a meaningful part of it by picking up bottles and cans from the street that other people didn't bother to get the 5-cent deposit back on, couldn't it just be 10 cents? Of course, that'll increase the cost of every bottle to the original purchaser by that 5 cents, but there's an issue. Daniel, there's certainly a double standard, or maybe better to say no standard here, right? And I don't even think that this is what you're trying to call out in your book, but the conservative ethic on paper is states' rights. It goes back to slavery, and Jim Crow is the most iconic examples that everybody knows. But for much of the 20th century, the general conservative belief was that the federal government was leaning left, so they would frequently cite the principle of federalism, which refers to state power, and they would cite the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Folks, if you haven't heard it recently, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people." That's the 10th Amendment. But now, in power in Washington, the conservative movement isn't so federalist. It wants to tell California that it can't have its own carbon policy, that states can't make mifepristone available by mail order, that they can't have affirmative action or other DEI policies at the state level, and we could go down a long list. So is there a single standard that your movement promotes, or are you just reacting to power as it currently exists and fighting your battles in state legislatures because that's where you find them?
Well, I would never use the word just before power when it comes to politics. Certainly, in a democracy, power is distributed fairly based on the elections, but it's a really important thing. Here's what I'd say. I go back just very briefly and hopefully in a lively way to the Federalist Papers, which, made clear that federalism was about preventing monarchy and preventing a centralization of power that could lead to despotism. But it wasn't an excuse for racist laws or a justification for undoing government's capacity to improve people's lives and build big things. That happened over time, as you point out. It happened in the compromise that was in the original Constitution. It happened before the Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-New Deal, as you point out, in the conservative and Reagan movements. But there's nothing about state power that means it can't be used to drive forward people's individual rights to have equal opportunity as all other Americans, or can't be done to build government. In fact, it was states in the New Deal, our state, a former state senator, Franklin Roosevelt, and Francis Perkins, who went on to be labor secretary, who built government capacity in New York State people had never seen before taking it to Washington as the New Deal. So, Reagan was super conscious of this. He had ALEC lawmakers in the White House every year. I was never invited to the White House in my time in office. Now, I was a mid-bencher, but there's not the same focus. Donald Trump has been personally calling state lawmakers. In Texas, it was just reported he did it in South Carolina, even though they rejected him in the last week. He did it in Indiana over the last year. The focus on an understanding of state power is a necessity if you're going to be a participant in our democracy. What states do with it, I have a worldview that, the promise of the Declaration of Independence is the greatest promise people have ever made, and we need to make it ever more real every day. But if you have a different worldview, you should still be fighting in the states. And that's the real message here, especially because, and I know people won't love to hear this, but it's very, very hard to have an impact on federal outcomes as a regular, everyday citizen. It's extremely likely and possible to have an impact in states. We just heard examples from just two people who called in were having an impact. And and so the States Project is really about understanding power, because that's a good thing, not a bad thing in a democracy, and then giving people the tools through giving circles to do something about it where it matters most.
You note that so many Trump policies, to get to the current moment, have targeted state power, and so many recent Supreme Court decisions have been about empowering or limiting the states. Want to cite a few top Trump interventions you have in mind?
Well, for sure. I think the most chilling, the thing that people should be, I think, most worried about in our democracy right now, and this is the times we live in, are Truth Social posts in which Donald Trump has said that elections should be federalized. He also pushed the SAVE Act, which failed in Congress, but he said was the single most important thing. I believe he made a Jesus comparison when the SAVE Act was being considered. He has put out executive orders to force states to share information with the federal government so that they can meddle in elections. That is A1, top of the list interference. And by the way, counter to what Ronald Reagan said, which is the reason we don't have autocracy in this country is because of states. There are some others, though, because he has refused to send money to states that has been allocated by Congress legally. When he sent ICE to the streets of Minnesota before it murdered 2 Americans in cold blood, he was pushing the governor and the state police to follow their edicts, even though that is not their job. Their job is to follow the state constitution within the limits of the federal constitution. So every one of the most chilling acts of his fundamentally comes down to this interplay.
So as we start to run out of time, your book is optimistically titled The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union. So why, from your obviously more left-leaning political standpoint, do you think state government can save our union rather than seeing this devolution of power as a threat?
There's just 2 reasons. The first is the one I was just talking about. Small numbers of people can have an outsized impact on their lives and our country's future by focusing on states. And today they're mostly left to the worst players in our political system, whether that's inside lobbyists or Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. If even a small number of people take up this argument and this fight, whether by joining the States Project or doing other work themselves, as we heard from the callers, it will change the direction of the country. People are not observers to the destruction of their democracy. If they focus at the level, they can have an impact. The second reason is good things are happening all over this country every day. And the state budget, you're going to talk about, its strengths and weaknesses, but it's a state budget that pushes things forward. People talk about paid family leave being a thing that every other developed or wealthy country in the world has, but not the United States. Well, actually, more than 100 million Americans do have it, thanks to state action. You talk about even a state like Texas, which generates more clean energy at lower kilowatt hours for consumers than any other state in the country. When you get out of the Manichaean good and evil struggle of D.C., where party is all that matters and power is about whether the democracy continues to exist, you start getting inspired every day. I was inspired by South Carolina Republicans and Democrats who said no way to mid-decade redistricting just in the last week, even when the president personally called them.
Daniel Squadron, former state senator from parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan, and co-founder of the States Project, author now of The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.